Greetings. This coming week, the 25th Sunday of the year, finds our scripture readings as coming from Isaiah, from the 55th chapter, 3 verses there, 6 through 9. We will begin in the second reading, 4 weeks of listening to sections from Paul's letter to the Philippians. And this week it will be the chapter 1, verses 20 to 24, and then rounding out with a verse from chapter 27. So there's a couple skipped there. And the Matthew reading this weekend is chapter 20, beginning at verse 1 and going to verse 16. Well, now, as you might notice, if we are looking at chapter 20 this week, weren't we looking at chapter 18 last week? And so once again, we need to kind of fill in, because in noticing the sequence of material that's presented by Matthew, we do get a sense of his full story. And although there's certainly an important value to the selections that are made each week for Sunday, something is often missed in the episodes or verses or chapters that are left out. So, last time, as we remembered in chapter 18, were really kind of ways of how do we live as a community. It was always about, you remember, reconciliation and forgiveness. Well, chapter 19 now might be entitled Family Themes. And it is material in which certain issues, which are not unique to Matthew's gospel, but which have a particular Matthean twist to them, are presented. Jesus begins in this chapter by not teaching, but by again healing. And it's important to remember that in the gospel tradition, the synoptic tradition, particularly 3 major images are always presented about Jesus. That he is a teacher, that he is a healer, and of course that he is a prophet. Prophet, again, as we pointed out, being a spokesperson, in this case, for God, and putting together the teaching and healing bit, announcing the coming of the kingdom of heaven. Well, the very beginning, therefore, of chapter 19 finds Jesus leaving the Galilee and moving to a region of Judea, because he is moving ever south to Jerusalem, but as a good Hebrew will avoid the territory of the Samaritans. And so we're in an area that's not quite geographically defined in Matthew's story. It then begins, after that, with a number of concerns about the question of divorce. Now, this is important to keep in mind. Divorce needs to be looked at from the contemporary viewpoint of Matthew, and Jesus. And in our own time, different understandings certainly have emerged, so we need to be careful about pushing too much the position that is taken by Jesus as Matthew sees it. The question is raised, is it lawful for a man to get a divorce for any cause? And Jesus' response to that is, well, what God has joined together, and here he pictures really a Genesis, that is a book of Genesis viewpoint. What God has joined together should always remain, and that there should be no reasons why that is the case, except, and it is Matthew here now who introduces what was known as an exception clause, unlike Matthew or Mark and Luke, where this does not appear. Now, they then say to him, that is, and again, remember, this is the teachers, these would be the Pharisees and the scribes, but they say that Moses gave a command that a man might get a divorce. And Jesus rejoins by saying it was not a command, but rather that it was a concession. That because certain things happened, this was granted, but this was not part of the original design. So again, Jesus is pictured as holding pretty firm to the original design about marriage. Well, the argument that is made a lot, well, what exactly was this exceptional clause? And it's not ever clear. In the Greek, it's not clear as to what exactly it meant. Many see it as a kind of a sexual action or activity, and there are a number of viewpoints that are offered by interpreters as to exactly what it was. But it is fair enough to say that Matthew's community was aware of some possibility of divorce being okay. Then the issue is raised about the state of life, and the question of celibacy is here raised. It's important to notice, because later tradition will say, well, when Jesus speaks of celibacy and marriage, that he is really placing one as a better way than another. That is not what Matthew has in mind, and it's not what he teaches. He simply pictures Jesus as saying, some people, for all kinds of reasons, remain eunuchs, or the state of celibacy. Not that it's better, but that certainly it's not worse than marriage, because you will remember that the tradition of Jesus' time was that marriage was the expected state. In fact, there's one of the quotes from one of the rabbis of the time said that any Jew who does not have a wife is not a man. So marriage was very much the ordinary way of doing things. But there were some groups, even in Jesus' time. For example, we are learning from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the community of the Essenes did see a value in celibacy. So there were a couple of groups within Judaism who saw this as a value or as an interesting way of life. But it's not presented as one is better than the other, only that they are two different ways of doing things. So again, to be fair, take Matthew's story for what it is. Jesus certainly argues for the importance of marriage, does include an exceptional clause, does mention the state of two different states, rather, of celibacy and of marriage, but both in their own way, helping one live out the kingdom. So those would be family issues. And then there's one other family issue, of course, children. Well, we saw that Jesus had used children earlier on in another episode as an example, and it is here important that Jesus, by laying his hands on, the little episode in chapter 19 here, laying his hands on the children, sees them as having equal rights and values as adults, and therefore as part of the larger family community. I did want to say in passing, with regard to the divorce issue, there were in Jesus' time, and you may know this and have heard this before, two schools of thought with regard to why a man might get a divorce. So backing up to this point a little earlier on, one was called the school of Shammai, Shammai. And this was the school that said you could get a divorce for some shameful act. Usually it had to do with some sexual misconduct. But there was another school of thought, following what was known as the school of Hillel, 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 who argued that a man might get a divorce for a lesser cause. So, for example, if a wife spoiled the supper meal for him, might be a cause. Or if the man found a more beautiful woman than the wife he was married to, might be a reason. So you can see these were certainly lighter reasons. And the question might have been, were the scribes and Pharisees wanting Jesus to take a position? Was he going to take the more rigid, ordinary one, or was he going to take the more, I don't think you want to call it liberal, but certainly a lesser reason? And for that reason, it well might be that Jesus said, I'm not playing that game. I say, go back to the way in which originally was, and that would be a teaching. So no one should get a divorce. Now, from another perspective, just an aside here, one notices that it was men who could get the bill of divorce or the statement of divorce, and women could not. So in kind of ruling out men, in effect, he was kind of perhaps offering a certain protection to women in this regard. So there are a number of issues that are certainly connected here. Chapter 19 concludes with the visit of a young man who comes to Jesus and asks him, what must I do, good master, to attain eternal life? Well, Jesus, first of all, says, look, good belongs to God alone, so let's be fair about that. And if you want to attain salvation or the kingdom, then keep the Torah, keep the law. Well, the young man says, but I've been keeping those. And Jesus is questioning, and what part of the Torah do you observe? And he mentions all the parts that belong to what we call the second table. That is, the parts of the commandments, honor father and mother, etc., that have to do with, of course, family, but also have to do with neighbor. Well, he says, I do all of those things. What more? And Jesus says, well, there's one other thing you could do, is if you choose to become perfect, is to give up over all of your possessions and come follow me. Well, the young man is saddened at that and walks away. To which the disciples then say, well, listen, if possessions are so bad, kind of remember that the thinking was the more possessions one had, the more blessed by God one was. So when the disciples are not quite sure here, Jesus then says, you know, it's harder to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Now, many have tried to kind of reduce this to say, well, there was a gate that was called the camel gate and all that. But that really wasn't true. It really is an exaggeration. Jesus said it's very hard. Now, whether or not a camel could ever get through the eye of a needle, I think boggles your imagination a little bit, okay? So he is saying, Matthew's Jesus, that wealth can be a real problem in observing kingdom's ways. He's not saying you have to give up everything, but it is perhaps the question of where does attachment lie. So that would be the material that's developed in chapter 19. You can go and kind of look that over, but notice it does have to do with all kinds of issue of family, whether it be spousal relationships, whether it be children, whether it be the young, and what possessions in life they find important. Now we come to chapter 20, which is the gospel for this weekend, which begins and is framed, that is like brackets on looking at what's in between, with the phrase, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Now, this saying, of course, was prevalent in the synoptic tradition, but it's interesting the way in which here Matthew uses it to frame a parable, an interesting parable that is found, again, uniquely in Matthew's Gospel, and which is a parable that sometimes has caused others to be wondering. And it's the story of a man who has a vineyard, and he goes out at the beginning of the day to hire workers for his vineyard. And he says to them, if you go and do the work, I will give you a day's wage. All right, so they go. Well, then, and you probably are familiar with this story, but then he goes out at the 3rd hour, which would be 9 o'clock, goes out at the 6th hour, which would be 12 noon, and goes out again at the 9th hour, which would be 3 in the afternoon. He finds workers still there, and he hires them to go and work in the vineyard, promising them a just wage. He does not tell them what it's going to be, but he sends them out. He goes out then at the 11th hour, which would be about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But notice, by the way, how in English we use the term the 11th hour, meaning kind of close to the end of something, and says to them, why are you still standing here? And they say, well, no one has hired us. And he says, go into my vineyard. Now, notice that it's a vineyard. That means they were picking grapes. The amount of time to pick grapes is pretty limited, so it needs to be done within a relatively quick period of time. As you may know, vineyards didn't grow automatically. It really took almost 4 years for a good vineyard to be able to produce grapes that either were usually made into wine, and that of course was an important drink for most of the people of the Mediterranean region of Jesus' time. Now the question could also be raised, why were these workers standing around? Why didn't the owner rather, hire enough workers all at once? Well, did he miscalculate? It is true to say that maybe the workers he hired early on worked faster, and he saw that he needed more helpers to kind of get the grapes in. It's hard to say. And it's also important to notice that the workers who were hired for this task would probably be, as we would know today, day laborers. They weren't men who had jobs regularly, but it was very seasonal, and so therefore it was important that they get a job or be able to earn a living. So as it was, they were hired. Now, comes 6 o'clock, comes the end of the day, the work day, and the owner of the vineyard says to his manager, bring them in and bring them all together and have them start being paid by beginning to pay the last hired first. And they are received a day's wage. And that proceeds down according to the way in which they were hired. So obviously the 9th hour would be next, the 6th hour, etc. Well, those who were hired first, you can imagine that they're kind of saying, this guy's pretty generous, gives a day's wage to a guy who worked 1 hour. We should probably be getting more, and are very disturbed when they receive simply the day's wage. Well, they kind of look at the vineyard owner, or maybe it's at the manager, but what's going on here? We worked harder. We put up with the sun and the sweat all day long and probably worked even faster than those people who were hired at the last hour, and we get the same wages they did? It's not fair. Well, perhaps it's important to notice this isn't a question about fairness. It's about the generosity of the owner in this case, and some would say that perhaps it might be an image of God, because they get kind of upset, and he says, are you mad at me because I'm generous? Are you giving me, now it's interesting in the translation that we heard, that we are you are mad at me or envious of me because I'm generous? The original Greek says, because I have the evil eye. Now that's interesting, because there was a theory that the eye, and this is found in other parts of Scripture, that the eye was the window into the soul. So if you're saying that you have the evil eye, that means that there's some evil within that person. Well, the translators decide to give us just let it be generous as I'm generous. Are you jealous? Well, you can see, and I suppose there is sympathy that goes in their regard, but the whole point that is being made, I think, by this teaching is that in the reign of God, an open-handed and generous God is there to equally give goods to everyone. In a certain way, salvation is not earned. It is the generosity of God that is important here. That doesn't solve the question, I'm sure, in the minds of some. Some might say is this a question of justice? After all, does justice mean that everybody gets paid the exact amount that's agreed upon? Well, if that's the question of justice, the owner has done that, hasn't he? He didn't say to the first ones hired, I'll give you more, just said, I'll give you a day's wage. Or does justice mean being paid what others are paid for the same amount of work? Well, now, if that's the issue, then you can see that there might be an argument, because those who picked grapes beginning at 6 in the morning probably picked more than those who picked at 5 in the afternoon. So the justice issue is interesting, and this has made this parable subject to a number of ways, or different ways rather, of interpretation depending on who is reading it. But I think it is perhaps important to see that this is the basic teaching. And is it connected with the fact that then this parable ends with, again, what it began with, and some who are last shall be first, and some who are first shall be last? Well, I suppose you could take the parable and see that indeed is worked in. Is that what is the issue? But if we're going to talk about justice, then divine justice is what is necessary to sustain life at the end of the day. And in that way, then everyone gets a day's wage, and there is a justice that is built not on the human standards of how we would organize it, but on the way in which God would consider it to be important. A day's wage, well, may have been a denarius, and even then a denarius probably took care of a personal's need. Did it take care of a family? So there are a number of kind of practical issues that are raised by this parable of the vineyard owner. But you can see that the generosity of the owner is something that Matthew is teaching his disciples, something that they perhaps need to continue to learn and to be aware of. So that would be the parable of Matthew. Now we're beginning in the, as I mentioned at the start today, 4 weeks in the second reading of words from Paul's letter to the Philippians. Now Philippi, as you know, was an important trade city of Greece. I don't know how good your map is, but as you move from Asia into Europe, it's perhaps one of the first cities that is in Europe. A little bit of the story of Philippi was started many, many years before the time of Paul and before the time of Jesus. It was made a Roman colony in the year 5860, before the Common Time, and it was made. I should be careful about giving dates here. Became 167 before the Common Time. Now, why it was important is, I make a whole lot of time here, but in the year 42 before the Common Time was a very important battle that took place when Mark Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius, who had taken over, were trying to become the head of the Roman world. And the Battle of Philippi was fought, and that's when Mark Antony won. And then there was the Battle of Actium, which was 2 years later. And the point of mentioning all of this is that many of the Roman veterans now, when they retired, settled in Philippi. And so Philippi became a city with a variety of backgrounds of people who had different religions and that. Philippi also was an important trade city. Again, coming across the east, would pass through Philippi and move on to Rome. And as I say, it was a city to which Paul came, and we're indebted here to the book of the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul arrived here, as far as we can see from the Acts, in the year 49. And it was here that he started a community. There was only a very small group of Christians who accepted Jesus' way, and his first convert was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple, and it was there that the first house church of Christians was set up. So we're indebted to the Acts for that little bit of background about Paul and his coming there. Now he writes this letter to the Philippians. He mentions that he is in prison. Now, we're not sure where that prison was. It could have been in the city of Caesarea over in Palestine, where he was in prison from the years 56 to 58. Or it could have been when Paul was in prison in Rome from the year 58 to 60. So we're not sure where Paul was, because he mentions in the opening part of this letter, I write from being in prison. And one of his fellow disciples had come from Philippi to bring him some support, both some moral support and perhaps also a little bit of financial support. And in his letter, so we'll just today give a little bit of background on this and perhaps develop this further as we go along, is very grateful to the Philippians. This is a wonderful, kind of what almost we would say a friendship letter. Paul here is not critical about anything that's going on in the Philippian community, where he is in other letters, kind of concerned about things. But he's just so grateful for their concern for him, and he writes back how concerned he is for them. And in the little section which is given us this weekend, that is where Paul says, I'm here ready to die, but also to live. And I'm sure that I'm probably going to live more because of your support and of your care for me. And I want you to know how devoted I am to you and thankful I am for you, and how what I do here as I can in prison, I hope to do when I come to visit you. So Paul has every intention here of visiting again the community at Philippi. He likes the Philippians. He often praises them for their generosity, both their generosity of spirit and their generosity of material goods. So with that in mind, be attentive to the justice of God, to the graciousness of God as we gathered this weekend, and certainly are grateful for the abiding gift of presence that we know Paul experienced in his life, that we experience in our lives because of the Lord. So thank you, and have a good week.